Today, we are tearing down the PlayStation 5 Pro to see just how Sony put together the most powerful console yet. Before that, though, I do want to mention I have had a chance to play a few games on my Pro, and so far, I've been happy with the resolution and the performance bump for certain titles. One that really has been mentioned as much is Assassin's Creed Mirage, that actually just removes the different graphics modes and gives you 4K 60 by default with better visuals than the base system. Also, Armored Core 6 looks and runs better even without a patch, just leveraging the added GPU headroom. While this isn't a review for what PS5 Pro can do in games, when the circumstances line up, it can do some pretty impressive stuff, even in what is, I think, a relatively compact console. Okay, well, to be fair, the baseline with the original PS5 didn't exactly set the bar high since it was so large and heavy, but the Pro is lighter while taking up slightly less space. I have seen many people say the most impressive game so far is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and yeah, it probably is the most noticeable upgrade as it makes the performance mode running at 60 FPS super clean looking. Makes me wish I had waited to play the game, but let's be real, Square will figure out a way to release this game again, so I'll circle back around then. Getting into the Pro is pretty straightforward with the 4 side plates popping off from pressure, revealing the disk drive I had installed previously. This just lifts up and out of the way. The door here covers the expandable storage, and then to the right of that is a door covering the CMOS battery, both of which are held down with Phillips head screws. It's a nice change to see the CMOS battery be so accessible after issues that were brought up earlier in the generation with the C-bomb situation. Basically, if the battery inside your PS4 died and you weren't connected to the internet, it wouldn't play any of your games. Even physical ones were seeing issues. It was eventually fixed with a software patch, but it did put the hard to replace battery into the spotlight, and it looks like Sony heard everyone. It's not something you have to worry about for a long time since these batteries tend to last 10 to 15 years most times, but it's good to have for easier repairs in the future. From here, you will need a T8 bit, and you're about to see many different size screws as we take this system apart, so it's a good idea to find a work area where you can map out your screws and keep them organized. The fan is next up, and after 4 screws are removed, it lifts straight up. This one is a Foxconn variant and isn't much different than the base PS5 console. Size comparisons have already been made, and it looked a bit smaller, but nothing that should be very concerning. It is a blower fan that moves air from the front of the PS5 to the back. I think at times a fan can be a focus point when it comes to cooling for consoles, but most times when a system is struggling to cool itself, it generally comes down to dust clogging the airway or poor connection for the chipset and the heatsink. The rest of the way here on the outside are T8 screws scattered around the edges. Sony still does the markings by screws that are longer using the 3 dots, so if you get lost or forget where a screw goes, this can at least help out a bit. Sony does have a warranty sticker on the right side that is pretty much useless at this point, but at least they dressed it up a bit and used one of those fun PlayStation symbol stickers. There's a couple of T8 screws on the opposite side as well that need to be removed, and now the shell will lift up completely. Here's something interesting. The stripes on the casing are actually removable. There's one screw along with a clip that holds it into place, and I guess if you want to paint it, this makes case modding easier, or if you just don't want the 3 stripes on each side, you can technically remove them. Okay, CMOS battery is next, and it isn't screwed in here. It just lifts up and gets unplugged. There's this big heat sink that is sitting down on the metal case and can simply be lifted off after loosening it with some wiggling. This is significantly larger than the heatsink that was equipped outside the older PS5, and while it is working to cool the entire metal casing, it's certainly focused around key points that deal with power flow in the system. Wireless antenna cables are next and just pop up off the board here. You can see they run down and around to the top of the console, which is probably the best spot for it since when standing, it would be the highest point for that console. Now it's time to remove a stupid amount of silver screws all around the perimeter of the metal casing. At this point, it seems pretty clear Sony really hasn't been able to figure this one out and eliminate the need for so many screws. Keeping the board as straight and supported as possible is key since bending and flexing can cause a bunch of issues for the main chipset. This is something we've seen in previous generations with the Xbox 360 and the PS3. And since this one here is rated at 390 watts, it looks like they'll keep playing it safe here with all the screws. Speaking of which, with the board out, we can see the power supply underneath. It's unfortunate that the power supply is behind the motherboard, since you'd have to go through all of these steps up to this point to replace it. Power supplies have always been a failure point in the past with previous generations and was always way easier to get to than this. At least they're keeping with the matte black plastic trend for the casing, I guess. Anyway, now that the main board is out of the case, we have the heatsink front and center. It's not the massive copper plate we had with the original day one PS5, rather a closer look to the revised PS5 systems that came out a couple years later. For example, when compared to that refurbished PS5 I checked out a few weeks ago, we can see much more of an emphasis on copper pipes, putting some space between the heatsinks and the chip. In this case, with the Pro, we have 7 pipes versus the base PS5 6. The newer slim PS5 matches up a bit better with the heatsink configuration, but only has 5 heat pipes. All of this makes sense considering the PS5 Pro is expected to produce more heat, and it looks like Sony did work to accommodate this from an initial look here. We still need more in-depth testing with temperature probes and benchmarks, but we'll save that for another day. Popping the back metal casing off, you see just how much this is helping to dissipate heat from the components on the board. All these light blue spots are different thermal pads that connect something like a memory chip to help cool it down. Makes sense why they have an extra heatsink on the backside now, doesn't it? There's a bracket on the back held down with 2 screws, and after removing it, we can free the board from the heatsink and get a look at all of the liquid metal that Sony piles on. At first, I remember being really concerned about how much they use, but it's become pretty clear that the system is set up to accept even too much liquid metal than is actually needed. Maybe it just gives them some leeway at the factory level during assembly, but there's something a bit different about the way the Pro actually handles all of this. So as I've done before with the original PS5, I cleared the liquid metal off the chip and removed the plastic shielding to get a better look at it, but as I was cleaning off the heatsink side, I noticed a change to the surface. It looks like Sony cut some lines that resemble channels into the contact point for the chip. I assume this was done for 2 reasons. One, it helps to disperse the liquid metal much more evenly, since when it's screwed in, you can get some flat spots between the chip and the heatsink surface. The other part, though, is the way liquid metal works. It makes more sense to have it build up in these channels to help with heat transfer. I double-checked images of previous PS5 consoles to make sure, and yeah, it looks like this is a new thing for the PS5 Pro specifically. It's pretty clever. Our main chipset is here, and the die looks to be a bit thinner and takes on more of a rectangular shape. It does look like the fabrication was shrunk here, which would put it below the 6 nanometers found in the Slim. The ID for this chip is CXD90072GG. Unfortunately, I don't have an easy way to measure the die here during the teardown, but doing a very rough estimate in something like Photoshop, it does appear to be potentially in the neighborhood of a 20% reduction in size from the Slim, so this very well could be a 5 nanometer chip, maybe even smaller. All right, now let's take a look around the board at some of the major components. The South Bridge is the same that you would get in any of the other PS5 systems, which it makes sense. You really would not need to upgrade this at all, but we do have a new addition here with the 2 gigabytes of DDR5. This sits actually right around the 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 off to the side. This is specific to the Pro and is mostly here to free up some of the shared GDDR6 memory for use in games. This is our wireless chip and does add Wi-Fi 7 support to the console, which is a step up from the previous Wi-Fi 6 support in the regular PS5. The HDMI encoder looks to be the same one that is used in the regular PS5, which came up as an issue for high-end displays at the beginning of the generation, since there seemed to be some bandwidth limitations with 4K 120 and 8K, which is more of a reality with the Pro versus the previous system. Let me know down in the comments if you use an 8K TV for gaming and how the Pro has worked out for you, though, if you've picked one up. The main controller chip for the solid-state storage was moved to the opposite side of the board compared to the original system, and while it could be a move maybe to help cool it better, it could also just be something that was necessary when redesigning the board. It's hard to say. I have to say, though, looking over this board, this setup, Sony is really getting things figured out with their overall console design. When you see the inside of the Pro, it starts to make sense how we ended up with a mid-gen refresh that is more powerful and can come in smaller than the console they released 4 years ago. It's become less about cutting corners and more about refining the manufacturing process and raw materials that are needed to fit into a certain price point, which admittedly isn't exactly cheap. Still, it is nice to see these console manufacturers figuring out the annoyances we've had previously, like a jet engine fan or failing chipsets. So here's hoping that's a trend that continues here with the Pro, which, based on what we're seeing from this teardown, I think it's set up at least nicely. Sure, the upgraded heatsink isn't on the level of the original PS5, which I still believe was over-engineered and unnecessary looking back on it today. Funny enough, this would have been the console to use that massive copper plate on, but even so, the most that will probably happen here is a slightly louder fan to keep the thermals in range. I opted to put some Thermal Grizzly on this Pro, which still unnerves me to have to use more than usual with liquid metal, but the system legitimately eats this stuff up, so don't try this at home with a freshly delidded CPU. Everything back together and the Pro comes on and plays no problem. I'll need to leave it on for an hour or so to make sure the connection with the chip and heatsink is good with the liquid metal application, so for now, let me know what you think about the PS5 Pro down in the comments, and I'll catch you guys next time.